Fall is my absolute favorite time of year. I'm excited that the weather is cooling off, and I've already started wearing my coziest sweaters. My heather gray Mongolian cashmere sweater from Quince was the first thing I pulled out of my closet as soon as the weather turned cooler. It's soft and warm and so stylish. I wore it all the time last winter and it's still in great shape. $50 is an unbelievable price for a cashmere sweater like this. Quince delivers luxury quality pieces at half the price of similar brands because they cut out the middleman and partner directly with top-tier ethical factories. Layers are the name of the game this time of year. If you need a new winter coat, they have beautiful coats and jackets. They have everything you need for your wardrobe this fall, as well as beautiful linens, bags, and home decor. Pretty much everything you need for your home and wardrobe. Find your fall staples at Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
There's so many spaces in society today where we need to break open the communications. We need to be able to communicate more clearly and honestly with each other. We need to be able to listen better to each other. We need to be able to recognize other people's pain as well as our own pain. And only when we do that can we actually achieve the kind of society that we really aspire to.
That was Greg Walton on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Mac Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, a coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of Act Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey, listeners. You know the podcast is values-based work for us and a labor of love. The podcast industry has been a roller coaster ride, and there are some expenses involved in hosting a podcast. We'd love to keep bringing you great episodes, and we could use your support. Help us keep the podcast going next year and beyond. You can do that 2 ways. You can support us on Patreon. For just $5 a month on Patreon, you'll be able to listen to the podcast ad-free. Or show us your love by making a one-time donation in any amount on Buy Me a Coffee. Think of it as taking a co-host out to coffee to thank us for the podcast. You can link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee accounts on our website. Thanks for your support. Hello, everyone. Today we're doing a little episode introduction, which is, kind of back to our old ways because lately we've been doing post-episode discussions. But I have Emily here with me today so that we can talk about the episode ahead, which is with Professor Gregory Walton on his book, Ordinary Magic.
There were so many great ideas throughout this conversation, and it seems a little like all different parts of kind of how we think and how we live. What would you say, Debbie, were the main ideas, just to orient listeners to the episode?
Well, I think that what Greg does here with this book and with this conversation is that he draws from all of this really super fascinating social psychology research that has been going on for years. So things like, mindset and Carol Dweck's work. Carol Dweck is one of his colleagues at Stanford. They do a lot of research together. Things like stereotype threat and belonging uncertainty and just all these areas. And he really applies it to people's lives. So people's lives at school and at home, and when they're maybe getting into thought spirals, and how we can make some small shifts in the way we think and in what we're doing and how we're talking about things, and how these really small shifts can have a big impact that's very applicable to our day-to-day lives. And it's kind of cool to hear about some of the research studies, which there's a lot of great ones in the world of social psychology. But I think what he does is he takes it a step further into how do we put these findings from social psychology into practice to make our lives better and to make our relationships better and to make the world better.
Yes. And you cover so much territory because you focus on kind of individually what can happen with our downward spirals with our thoughts, right? You focus on relationships, kind of how we get into these patterns with romantic partners, for example. You get into more institutional relationships with individuals like college students, or the very end was so interesting to me about the juvenile offenders who were coming back from detention into the community. And that's actually work my husband does. So it's very close to my heart, knowing the complexity of these young people's lives. But he gave a great example of how a small change in how to manage that transition makes a big impact. So I loved how it just covered so much territory in this conversation.
Well, and I think as a therapist, it was interesting to listen to it in terms of, the issues that people bring into therapy and even couples therapy, which I don't really do couples therapy. I know Yael does a lot of couples therapy, but I still have clients coming in talking to me about their relationships and, little shifts there. And then those thought spirals, which we talk about early in the episode. And to me, it's a little bit where mindset research meets cognitive behavioral therapy, because there's a lot of overlap there in terms of, something happens and we kind of spiral away with it and turn it into this much bigger thing. And like, how can we use some of what we know about psychology to keep ourselves from spiraling quite so much, or at least have some awareness that we're doing it and try to bring ourselves back from the spiral?
And how can institutions understand human psychology in a way that helps interventions be more successful?
Absolutely. Yeah. So many different levels, from the individual to relationships to these institutional and cultural shifts. It was pretty inspiring. There's a lot to the interview and to the book. And so I hope you enjoy the conversation. My guest today, Dr. Gregory Walton, is the Michael Forman University Fellow and Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. Much of his research investigates psychological processes that contribute to major social problems, and how brief psychological interventions that target these processes can address such problems and help people flourish over long periods of time. Greg's research has been published in leading scientific journals and has been covered in major media outlets, including the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. He's received awards from numerous organizations, including from the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, the Society for Experimental Social Psychology, and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. He earned his AB in philosophy from Stanford and a PhD in psychology from Yale University. His new book is called Ordinary Magic: The Science of How We Can Achieve Big Change with Small Acts. Greg, welcome. I'm really excited to talk to you about your book today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Debbie. I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, me too. And in fact, I read your book and then I was sitting there to prepare my questions and I was like, I don't even know where to begin, because there are so many really interesting stories and research studies and examples that you give and so many topics that you cover that I just didn't even know where to start. And so it's a great book with a lot to it. And so I figured, well, let's just start with your title, right? So you use social psychology and social psychology research to help people with a number of different problems they might be having: personal issues, relationship issues, social issues. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about why you call these interventions ordinary magic?
Yeah, well, there's a different term that's in the psychological literature, which is wise interventions, which comes up in the book as well. But it turns out that nobody really knows what the word wise means or what the word intervention means. So that seemed like a non-starter from a title perspective for the book. I think that they're ordinary magic because they have this kind of duality, like one's relationship to them has a kind of duality. So when you're looking at one of these interventions, so to speak, from the outside, and you kind of quantify, this is how much time it took, this is how long it took, and this is the consequence that happens, it's like, oh my God, that's like magic. Like there's no way that that could possibly happen. But when you're on the inside of the experience, so to speak, and you're able to kind of understand what it is that the intervention is contending with, like the kinds of questions that a person is facing, even implicit questions in a situation, then it feels very ordinary and very commonplace and very predictable. And you can kind of see how they work. And one of the goals of this book, I mean, from the preface on, is to pull back the curtain, to invite people in, to kind of spread and deepen the psychological wisdom that we all have and that we all build on, to understand ourselves and other people better, to understand the kinds of questions that come up in daily life. And you mentioned how broad the book is. And in a sense, the book is like a tour of psychological questions that come up as one goes through a life. You know, as you're a child and maybe you're contending with school, as you're a young adult, maybe contending with work or romance or relationships, as you're a parent and you're thinking about how to be a parent. There's predictable kinds of questions that come up at all of these stages. And to be wise is to kind of understand those questions, maybe even before they happen to you, to understand them in other people, and to know how to deal with them, how to act with regard to them.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought in that wise intervention piece too, even though, that didn't make the cut for the title. I do think there is something about this that I really appreciate, which is that these aren't just gimmicky things. Like there's a wisdom to them and they all make sense. I think if you look at them in that way, like the deeper questions that are happening, which we'll get to a little bit later in our conversation. And, just kind of how they do set people up for a little bit of a perspective shift on things, like kind of a different way of looking at things or a different reframing on things.
Yeah. And often, I think for wisdom, it's a word we associate with people who are older or more experienced. And often I think that's like what we get through wisdom is kind of the proper, that is to say, the adaptive perspective on the challenges of life. So, one of the literary forms that you probably can tell that I love from the book is children's literature. And one of the books that's in Ordinary Magic is Robert McCloskey's One Morning in Maine. And One Morning in Maine begins with a young child who's distraught because she has a loose tooth, and she thinks that having a loose tooth is a catastrophe, and it's going to mean that she can't have the wonderful day that she was imagining having with her father to go to Bucks Harbor. And the whole plot line of One Morning in Maine is about the efforts of her mother and then her father to help her to a different perspective, a wiser perspective on what it means to have a loose tooth. And the basic point is that means that you're becoming a big girl. And so Sal in the story is kind of contending with that and thinking about that, and then taking on that interpretation for herself. And then very importantly, using that interpretation to achieve the goal that she has, to go to Bucks Harbor and have a great day. And I think that a lot of wise interventions have that quality where people are kind of at a loss for how to make sense of something. They're at risk of having a catastrophic interpretation of something. And a wise intervention is offering people a different way to think about that, a way that might be more adaptive. And it's really an offer that people then contend with and think about. And if it seems useful, take up and play with and enact in their own lives in order to achieve something like working towards their goals in school, working toward their goals as a professional, working toward their goals in a relationship context.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the things that happens so often, and this is kind of part of your general model here, is that people can get into these spirals. So in Sal's case in the story, it's the tooth. She's kind of not sure what to make of that, and so it spirals into this place. And as a clinician, you're a social psychology researcher, and I'm a clinician. People use that term so often.
Yeah,
I actually literally a client sat in my office within the past week and used the word spirals, and I could see it happening. So could you talk about these spirals you're describing?
I think that it's a very useful thing to understand, and it's a very useful thing to understand a little bit from a distance. And sometimes that's why a third party, whether that's a therapist or a friend, it can be very helpful for people to kind of help clarify the spiral that's happening. I mean, one of the things about spirals is that partly they're psychological. So you have a worry, like let's just put it in a relationship context. Maybe you're in a new relationship and you're not sure that your partner really, is interested in you, really cares about you, or really values you. And that's a worry that's in your head. And that worry might come from all sorts of reasonable places. Like it might come from your own past experiences. And then the worry functions as a kind of lens through which you look out at the world. So maybe your partner is late for an event, like maybe they're late for a dinner. Maybe they don't respond to your text for a day, for 2 days, for 3 days. And that worry is informing how you make sense of that event. It's leading you to entertain the possibility that maybe this is evidence for the truth of that worry, that they don't value me, that they don't love me. And then but the spiral isn't just psychological. Like it's not just in your head. It also becomes behavioral and it becomes relational. So if you're feeling that your partner's lack of responsiveness means that they don't really have a real regard for you, and you start to act out on that, maybe you withdraw, maybe you don't respond to their text, maybe you lash out a little bit. Well, what is it that's visible to your partner is that behavior. And your partner might be going through their own spiral, and they might get pissed off at you, or they might feel like you don't really have that regard for them, and you get caught in this loop between two people, a loop that ends, in a place you don't want to be. And so, if you can step back and understand, how these cycles happen and how psychology contributes to them, then you can start to intervene. That is, you can start to create positive change.
Yeah. And it is so true that they can happen to all of us. And there is something about being able to even just talk about it or identify it that's really important. Like, okay, I can see what's happening here. I'm taking this thing that happened and it's getting bigger and bigger. That really does help shift the perspective taking on it. And I love how you tie it to these core questions that get stirred up for people, right? They kind of actually usually hit some sort of deep place within us. So can you, tell us about these core questions that come up.
I think it's really important. Like people can be so mean to themselves, like if you don't understand where, like you have, like maybe you're in this situation and your partner has been late to a date, for example, and then they finally show up. And maybe in truth, there's a very good reason why they're late, but you don't know that at the time. And so you lash out at them. And then your partner is upset with you and you kind of go down a downward spiral that evening of a fight, a conflict. And you might feel mad at yourself later. Like, why didn't I just listen? Like, why was I so impatient? Like, why did I react so strongly? And one of the words that's used in the book is TIFBIT, tiny fact, big theory. And there's times like tiny things, like your partner being late for a minute, seem to mean the world, like they don't love you. And when you have an objectively large reaction to an objectively small event, it almost always means that there's a good question in the background, like a lack of security or confidence in the relationship. And that's really like the lateness isn't the issue. Like, there's no problem sitting at the restaurant for half an hour waiting. Like that's not aversive. That's like, if ever there was a first world problem, that's a first world problem, right? The thing that's aversive is thinking that your partner doesn't love you, that you can't count on your partner, that they aren't really going to be there for you. And so if you can step back, both people, not just you, but both people, if you can step back and say, like, what's really the issue here? How can we use this fight and use this reaction to understand the thing that's actually making us anxious, the deeper question, the core question? Then you can put that on the table and you can say, like, the core question is that I don't actually feel that secure in this situation. And, maybe that comes from some past relationship experiences. Maybe that comes from some of our own dynamics, but that's really the issue. And then as a couple, like, how do you work on that together? How do you resolve that? How do you work through that? It's changing the fight from the superficiality, like the lateness, to the deeper question that's really at the heart of a relationship.
And it might, in that case, have something to do with like, do they love me? Or
do they love me? At the end of the day, do they love me? Like you're a human being, you're a social animal, you want to be loved, you want to love, you want to be in relationship with others. This is a fundamental part of our species. And like the idea that somebody doesn't really love you, that you're insecure about that, well, that's a very, there's a reason why we would have that worry.
Yeah. It makes so much sense given what we know about humans and what's important to us and how we operate. We would care about that. And there were a few other questions that you kind of frame your book around.
Yeah. So my research in this space really began with questions of belonging. And so you're going to school, you're going into a new school setting, you're really excited to be there. You're really hopeful that that's going to be a place that can help you become the kind of person that you want to be, to build skills and build relationships and join the kind of community of professionals that you want to be as you become an older version of yourself. But maybe you're worried about whether you can truly belong there. Maybe it seems like everybody else there, they like different kinds of TV shows. They like different kinds of music. It's a different region of the country. Maybe they're from a different social class background as you. Maybe there's a racial ethnic element where you're in a setting where you're in a minority, in a kind of visible minority form. Maybe that identity that you have has been tagged with pernicious stereotypes, like stereotypes of being less capable or less deserving of an educational opportunity. And so you might be wondering in the back of your mind, kind of for any of these reasons all the time, is this a place in which I can truly belong, where I'll be able to build those relationships? And then a very similar process can unfold. You get a bad grade on something, your professor says something unkind, you try to join a student group, you get rejected, people in your dorm go out and they didn't invite you and you feel excluded, you just feel homesick for home. And all of those feelings could seem like maybe this is evidence that I don't belong here. Maybe this is evidence that people like me don't belong here. And then what do? You withdraw, maybe you lash out, and you are kind of confirming the fear that you have by not building the kinds of relationships that you need in that setting. That's a downward spiral.
Great. Yeah, these examples are so good. And I do want to go back to the TIFF bit real quick, because you mentioned that. I love that, the acronym, which stands for Tiny Fact, Big Theory. Can you tell the story of how you came up with that?
Yeah. So my brother, he worked in the music industry for many years, and he was living in New York, and he was working on a show. He was a piano player. And he found himself one day with the very unusual circumstance of having the director of the show introduce him to someone who was in a totally different department, because this woman had sort of seen him and thought he seemed like a person that she'd like to get to know. And so then they started dating, and they were dating for multiple months, and he thought things were going reasonably well. And then they break up. She breaks up with him. And in the breakup conversation, he's trying to understand like how things went off the rails, like what happened here. And she says to him, "Do you remember that time we went to Macy's?" And he says, "Yes, we went to Macy's." And she says, "I had to tell you to tuck your shirt in. I can't be with you." And, my brother's like, "Tuck my shirt in? Like, what does that have to do with anything?" And we never found out what it was that meant to her, but it was something that signified who he was, who she was, what their relationship was, how it could never be. It carried a large meaning to her. And that meaning had kind of compounded over time in her head and led to the dissolution of the relationship. So we coined the term tiny fact, big theory. Like there's a tiny fact, but someone has a big theory about it. It's something, if you start to look, like all the time, there's these tiny facts, big theories around us, and they're all symptoms of the kind of implicit and explicit questions that arise. So you tell somebody, for example, what your SAT score was. Like maybe you're in your 20s, you tell someone what your SAT score was, and they're surprised you didn't do better. And you feel a kind of shiver behind you, a shiver of judgment that maybe they don't think you're smart, or maybe you're not as smart as you thought you were. That's like a tiny, tiny fact, but there's a big thing behind it, which is the kind of industry of IQ testing and standardized testing that, judges people in a narrow way. And it seems like a signifier of that big thing. So that's the origin.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been a sad thing for your brother at the time, but I think it's such a good example of like an untucked shirt equals you're not the right person for me, because whatever the narrative was, we don't know. But how
Right.
often we do that to ourselves and to other people, like one little behavior or one little thing that happened, we turn it into this whole big thing in our head, right?
Yeah, and I don't
Yeah.
want to tell that story in a way that in any way makes fun of the woman. And I said earlier, we can be mean to ourselves, and we can also be mean to other people when we don't understand the questions that they're facing. So the proper response, like if you're in that relationship dynamic, is not "ha ha, that's ridiculous, you're crazy." The proper response is, "Huh, I never thought about that. Like, tell me more. Like, what is it that means to you? Like, what happened there? Like, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? Help me understand this situation as you've experienced it." It's really about listening and getting perspective at that point.
Yeah.
And we have to do that for ourselves, but we also have to do that with the people that we're in relationship to when there's these tidbits that come up.
You know what this makes me think of is how often if people are dating, they will pick up on something small about the person on the first date and just be like, that's it. I'm not going on a second date because they, ordered mozzarella sticks or whatever. They tell some story you don't like or something. And it's almost like this kind of assumption about them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And, those assumptions, they can become calcified in the language of the book. That is, that they can become true over time. One of my former colleagues here at Stanford, who was at Harvard years ago, Nalini Ambady, did this.
Oh, yes. I knew her. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually in the office that she had when she was at Stanford, when she passed away at a much too young age.
She was a very kind person. I was very sad when she died.
Yes, and a wonderful psychologist. So her advisor, as I understand it, was Bob Rosenthal.
Oh, yeah. He taught my stats class.
Yeah, okay. And Bob Rosenthal is famous for his work on the Pygmalion in the classroom back into the late 60s. And that was work about how teachers' early beliefs about students' abilities get calcified over the school year. And if you lead a teacher to believe that a student is going to show a lot of growth in the school year, the teachers can actually elicit that from the student and make that belief true. And Nalini then was famous for her work on thin slices. So she showed that you could, this is going to your point about dating partners and fast impressions, you could show people a video of a teacher teaching, and you could ask them to guess the end of year teaching evaluations that students would give them. And people are remarkably accurate at that. And one way to interpret that is that people are just kind of accurate at pulling out from a thin slice of information qualities of another person. I think that's actually not quite the right way to understand that. I think that the process is a much more dynamic, self-fulfilling one, where the initial impressions that we form of another person can actually make that person into that person. So the student who looks at the teacher on the first day of school, we're talking in August now, it's early school days for both of all of our kids here.
Mm-hmm.
I get reports from our kids like, this teacher's this, that teacher's that. And like if you judge your science teacher boring on day one, like odds are they're going to continue to be boring because you're going to take a boring stance towards them. And there's a kind of production of that experience over time between the people.
Yeah. And part of, I think, your work is again, getting people to be aware of those instead of calcifying them. And so we've been talking about the downward spiral, like where we can snowball with things, we can make assumptions, we can get calcified in that place. Here's a little bit of probably an obvious question, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Are these spirals fixed? Are we just stuck with them? Or is there anything we can do to
I mean, that's the
them?
amazing power of wise interventions, right? Is that like when you can understand this, like, in my brother's case with the woman, at that conversation had come up earlier, and he'd had, the topic had come up earlier, and he'd been able to say, like, tell me more. Like that could have changed the direction of the relationship. And similarly, we were talking about belonging earlier. If you're in this, state of belonging uncertainty and you're worried about whether you belong in the place, and then you interpret every feeling of homesickness or every rejection as evidence that you don't belong in general, you reproduce the non-belonging. But if you have the idea, maybe everybody's worried about whether they belong at some level. Maybe everybody's trying to join a new community, even if they don't always show it, even if they don't want to talk about it, because what 18-year-old does. And maybe that's something that could get better with time. And maybe I might be able to kind of look around and say, like, how can I build my belonging here? Like, what are the communities that might be right for me? What we find with research is that can totally change the trajectory of a person's life. When you have that mindset, it can help people build their belonging, build relationships, find mentors, and ultimately be more happy and successful even a decade later. So these cycles are incredibly malleable. The trick is to understand the whole cycle and then where you can intervene, where you can create change within that process.
Why choose a Sleep Number smart bed?
Can I make my site softer?
Can I make my site firmer?
Can we sleep cooler?
Sleep Number does that. Cools up to 8 times faster and lets you choose your ideal comfort on either side. Your Sleep Number setting. Enjoy personalized comfort for better sleep night after night. And now, max out your savings. The more you buy, the more you save on beds, bases, and more. Plus, get free home delivery on any smart bed with base. Limited time. Check it out at a Sleep Number store near you or at sleepnumber.com today.
There's something pretty subtle about how people are approaching these types of questions, right? Do I belong? Who am I? Can I do it? These are some of the types of questions that are at the heart of these, that are at the heart of what we're grappling with here. But you're not saying, oh, just avoid the questions or stop thinking about those. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one thing is, this is not like blind optimism. Like, it's not like, oh, just ignore that, right? And it's not suppression either. It's not like, don't think about that. It's the stance that is effective is to say, these questions are real questions. They're reasonable questions. They often come from our lived experiences, from our sociocultural contexts. And people are struggling to answer these questions, even if they don't know it, even if they're suppressing the questions and aren't fully aware of them, they're struggling to answer those questions. That's why you get TIF bits, because the TIF bit seems like an answer to the question. And so what you need to do to create effective change is ways, either for yourself or for others, to offer people good answers to those questions, and to do those offers in ways that are often like really graceful and appropriate for the context and the role. So in One Morning in Maine, it's a very simple circumstance. There's a child, and there's a young child, and there's a parent. And the young child says, Mama, I'm not going to be able to have the great day I want because I have a loose tooth. And the mother is able to say, oh, a loose tooth. Everybody has a loose tooth. I had a loose tooth. What a loose tooth means is that's when you're becoming a big girl. And so she's offering this as an answer to Sal. And sometimes the offers are institutional. So another kind of context is kids who have a peanut allergy and are getting oral immunotherapy for their peanut allergy. So this is where you start with very small doses of peanuts and you kind of build up tolerance over time to help kids overcome peanut allergies. And when people go through this, they often have side effects, like non-life-threatening side effects, but things that are uncomfortable. You might have a rash, you might get a headache, you might have an upset stomach. And from a doctor's perspective, those are easily represented as just things you have to put up with. So here's some side effects. You might have an upset stomach. Like it's annoying, but that's what it is. But from a patient's perspective, like imagine you're 11 years old. You've been told your whole life that a single peanut could kill you. Now you've got this rash creeping up your body. Imagine you're a mother or a father and your child is going through this and this rash is creeping up there. It's very easy to catastrophize that in your mind, to think, oh my God, like, am I about to die? Is my allergy really severe and resisting treatment? And that can actually make the whole process of treatment worse. So then there's an institutional role. That is, there's a role for expertise, for the doctor to say, when you experience these side effects, sometimes that can be your body actually responding well to treatment, as some evidence suggests. And you offer that as an idea to patients and families, and then they can kind of take that up, and it actually makes the treatment go better.
Yeah. And one thing that I'm going to translate this actually into clinical talk here.
Sure.
Because I think one of the things that you're doing is you're going a little bit more for like understanding and common humanity and like kind of validating the concern, but you're not jumping in with like, oh, you're going to be okay. Or like a positive affirmation, like everything will be fine, or you're great. There's something a little bit more just like gentle about it.
Yeah, well, I think nuanced.
Yeah.
I mean, we went through a whole positive self-esteem movement, and that was not helpful, I think, in general. And so, still today, like you go into many elementary school classrooms and you see posters that say, like, you're the best, you're number one. And this is not real and authentic. When I went to college, like part of the origins of the belonging intervention was that when I went to college here at Stanford, it was like, rah, rah, rah all the time. Like, you're in college. It's amazing. You're at Stanford. It's amazing. Like, you're in California. How fabulous. Like, there was no room to acknowledge that this is like the modern coming of age ritual. This is a huge life transition. There might be times you don't feel good. There might be times you are lonely. There might be times you're homesick, and that's okay. Like, there was no space for that at all. So one of my colleagues, a researcher named Eddie Brimmelman in the Netherlands, has a recipe. He's interested in praise and parenting and narcissism. He's actually written a book in Dutch about narcissism called Admire Me is the English translation. But he has a kind of three-point recipe for raising kids with high, stable, kind of good self-esteem. And the 3 points are: first, unconditional regard. I love you no matter what. The second is honest feedback. Like, here's where you are. Here's what you're doing well. Here's what you're not doing well. And the third is a growth mindset. Like, here's how you can get better. Here's your path to improvement. And here's the role that I can play in that. So that's not about like, a kid like doesn't do well on a math test. It's not about ignoring that or saying that math is stupid or it doesn't matter. It's about like, okay, you didn't do well in the math test. I love you no matter what. And here's how we can get better.
Yeah, I love that.
I mean, some of Eddie's research is about how praise backfires. Like,
yes,
like parents who say, oh, my child is God's gift to humanity. Like, if they already have high self-esteem, they produce narcissism. And if they don't really have high self-esteem, like parents often do that because they're trying to compensate for what they perceive as a child's lack of confidence. It creates a standard that the child thinks that they can never achieve. It actually undermines their self-esteem.
Yeah. Or if they make a mistake or don't live up to that, then it's very fragile, right?
Yeah, very fragile. Yeah. And then in relationship context, like we were talking earlier about, wondering whether your partner really, really loves you. Like, a lot of that can happen because people don't really have high self-esteem. Like, you don't really feel like you yourself are that good or that valuable or that attractive. And then it seems very improbable that somebody else could. And then kind of blunt approaches, like just telling your partner time and again how much you admire them, don't work because the person's like, I don't know who you love, but it's not me.
Mm-hmm.
You need a more nuanced approach to that, a way that contends with where people are.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to dive more deeply into your research on belonging uncertainty. And by the way, if people are interested in this topic, your advisor, Jeff Cohen, came on the podcast, I think about a year ago, if I remember correctly, and talked about his book on this topic. And so we had a whole conversation about that. But I love the interventions that you described in your book, around belonging with college students and including the work you did with one of your students, Shannon Brady, about academic probation letters. So could you, kind of give us, like, I know it's probably a lot to nutshell this, but could you describe some of these interventions that you did? Because they're really amazing.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the probation work. So the probation work is kind of like the peanut allergy work I described earlier, where in the peanut allergy work, there's this expertise that the doctor has that they can tell a patient how to make sense of like a symptom like a rash. In the academic probation work, similarly, there's an expertise that an institution has in how to understand and define academic probation. So a student, like a college student, isn't doing that well. They're not meeting academic standards. Maybe their grades aren't high enough, or often more likely that they just didn't take enough classes or pass enough classes to get minimum credits. And what happens in standard practice is that the institution sends the student a letter that informs them of this fact and places them on some kind of probation, like some kind of probationary period. And if the student doesn't meet the requirements of that probationary period, they may be forced to leave the institution. Often, students react really badly to this situation. Like, they feel like deeply ashamed. and they feel deeply judged by the institution. They feel like one of the few losers who can't do it. And so when we began this relationship with a university to learn about academic probation, we were working with a committee that was kind of divided between two poles. One pole said, students really need to know there's consequences. They kind of need tough love. They need to kind of know what it's about. And the other poll said, but students react so badly. Like, we kind of need kitty gloves. Like, we have to be like really soft and almost obfuscate the fact that they're not performing up to standard. And as social psychologists, we looked at that and we're like, both of you are wrong. We actually need something more like what Eddie Brimmelman was describing. We need honest feedback, unconditional regard, and growth mindset. So what Shannon did as the lead researcher here was really dive deeply into interviewing students about this experience and starting to develop alternative language that institutions could use in this seminal initial notification letter. And ultimately, like, what that letter did was it articulated a number of key psychological points that were absent in standard letters. It said, you're not alone. Like, you'd be surprised about how many people experience academic challenges in college. You're not the only one. It said, there are specific kind of non-pejorative reasons why people can struggle in college. They might have to do with family circumstances. They might have to do with physical health circumstances. They might have to do with mental health circumstances. They might have to do with, a lack of understanding of, institutional requirements. There may be many different reasons. And it also expressed a commitment to supporting the student in contending with those challenges and a belief that the student could contend with those challenges successfully and succeed. It included stories from students who talked about actually being able to use the probation process to learn and to improve their experiences in universities.
And can I jump in to just say, you give examples of actual letters? I mean, they're a little bit abbreviated, but in the book.
Yes.
And they're so different. Like, the tone is just so much more harsh in the first version.
Yeah, I think that what often happens is that institutions, these letters are legal notices, right? They provide due process for an institution to, if they want to subsequently expel a student, they provide that function. And as legal documents, they go through a legal review. Like, the general counsel's office is going to review these letters to make sure that they're meeting the standards that they have. But typically, letters like this and other kinds of letters, like letters that notify students of an alleged honor code violation, like a cheating situation, for example, they don't go through any kind of psychological review. But they're also deeply psychological letters because they're defining, in fact, redefining the relationship between the student and the institution. They're redefining how the student feels they're seen and valued within the university context. And when they don't go through any kind of psychological review, they end up being legalistic and harsh. And students react to that. They feel like this place is viewing me in this, even when that's not the intention. Even when the staff that's kind of on the front lines has a very different view, the students begin that, engagement in that process feeling very judged, very shamed, very looked down upon, very, very othered. And that's completely unnecessary and really, really terrible.
And then what were the outcomes for people who...
We found, repeatedly that students experience less shame when they get the revised letter. They are less likely to consider dropping out from the institution. And they also, when we did a field trial, we found that this increased the odds that students successfully got off probation a year later. So it seemed to re-engage students with the process. One of the more proximate variables was that both of the letters ask students to come in soon and meet with an advisor and connect them to the resources that might support them in succeeding. And students who received the less stigmatizing letter, the letter that was attuned to the kinds of worries that people bring to the context, were much more likely to come in person and on time to meet with an advisor, connecting them to the resources that could actually help them in succeeding. So there you kind of see the spiral reverse rather than a negative one, an upward one where they're connected to people who care, people who are trying to support them, resources that are useful for them. That might be mental health people, it might be physical health people, it might be anything that the institution has on offer.
So again, small difference, just how this letter is worded, big result.
Yeah.
How about the belonging intervention with people who are just starting out college? Because that was another really fascinating one.
Yeah. So belonging intervention. So the probation intervention is like an intervention in a communicative act, the communication from the institution to the student. Belonging interventions are more kind of the student, how they're thinking about their own experience of belonging in the institution. And the heart of it are stories from other students that talk about the worries about belonging that they have, the varieties of ways that those worries come up, and talk about paths of growth in that belonging. So they're representing belonging as something that's normal to worry about at first and that can improve with time. And there's different kind of courses of that improvement and timescales of that improvement and forms of that improvement. But that improvement is possible and it can happen for different people in different ways. And then in the belonging intervention and in many other WISE interventions, the participating students themselves are not treated as if they're receiving an intervention, as if they're in need of help, as if they're deemed people who don't belong. Instead, they're represented as the people who are expert in this process. Like they're in the first year of college, they know what this is like. And how do they think about this process in a way that can be helpful for future students? So they're asked to write what we call a Saying is Believing essay. This is an opportunity to sit down and give advice to someone younger than them, a student coming in next year, about how belonging worries are normal, how that can get better with time. And this intervention has now been tested dozens of times with many, many different populations. There's been a big emphasis on it can have, life transformative consequences for young people. It can be particularly beneficial and powerful for people who are going into situations where they're in some form a minority. So, for example, for African American students in a selective 4-year predominantly white university, for first-generation college students, for women going into very male-dominated engineering fields. It's something that can be delivered at institutional scale. So we've learned how to create this kind of experience in an online context and support institutions in offering that to students as students are entering the institution. And we've done randomized controlled trials with tens of thousands of students testing its effectiveness within those settings. So that's really, like in both of these examples, the probation case and the belonging case, these are examples of institutions that are taking responsibility for the common kinds of psychological questions that are going to come up within that context. And that might be a question like, am I the only loser who can't do it when I'm getting placed on probation? Does the institution view me as in a terrible way? Or it might be just the kind of pervasive worries about belonging that almost everybody brings to a new institution. And when institutions can see that, when they can be wise to those worries, they can take these steps that are appropriate for them and their relationship with students to help students answer them and thrive within their settings.
Yeah. Since I interviewed your colleague, Jeff Cohen, about belonging and uncertainty, I've talked to it more with my therapy clients because I do think that often that's what's going on. That's what's a lot of times driving avoidance or driving social anxiety or self-criticism or something like that. And there's something about just helping people see that it's very normal to have that, that it doesn't mean you don't belong. You're just, feeling that discomfort of not being sure. Just naming that is a pretty powerful thing. And again, this idea of helping people see that they're not alone with it is so huge.
I mean, I think like a toddler who has something unfamiliar, go into their mouth and they like spit it out. Like we're so good at rejecting discomfort. Like it's almost like a tiff bit, like something that feels uncomfortable, something that feels awkward, like an awkward interaction. It's very easy for us to kind of go to global interpretations of that. It might be feeling uncomfortable in the first months at a new school. It might be having an awkward interpersonal interaction or having a point where you don't connect with somebody. It's very easy for us to then jump to like a very big conclusion about that. And to be able to say, no, it's of course you have that experience. Like there's a good this is the coming of age ritual in modern America. You're going to a whole new place, or you're having a conversation about a topic that you haven't talked about before. Of course it might be uncomfortable at first. in a conflict situation, in a relationship context, of course, that might be uncomfortable sometimes. But the discomfort might be actually part of working through the process and actually having the growth that you need. Just like in the peanut allergies, it's like the discomfort of the upset stomach. It's very easy to conclude that that means something really big and negative. And we kind of have to get more comfortable with discomfort.
You know, I'm going to tell you a quick story because this morning in the kitchen, my husband and I got in a little spat because there was these spices on the counter and we didn't really have a place to put them. And so we started bickering about this. Where are these spices supposed to go?
Why is it that all the fights are in the kitchen?
I know. I loved your dishes example in the book, right? How this is a major, did the spoons go right side up or upside down? I thought that was so funny. But I told him about your, in the chapter that you have about relationship conflict, that pretty much marriage just gets worse and worse over the years. Harder and harder. And we were laughing so hard and we were like, yeah, I mean, it's true, relationship. Yeah. But there's something actually kind of connecting about that. It's like, here we are so annoyed with each other about where these spices are supposed to go in the kitchen. And it's just like it's a Tuesday morning, it's just one of those things.
Yeah. I mean, the wonderful thing about that research, though, this is that it's not a foregone conclusion, as it turns out. So it does get worse over time. But if you kind of have that perspective, you bring some humor and you can laugh about it. Like, you can be stable, you can be, strong and stay close. Yeah.
What can we do for that? Can you give us a quick tidbit on how to get out of that downward spiral in a relationship? I know that's a big question.
The first thing is to really understand what the tidbit is signifying. So you have the fight about something like spoon side down or spoon side up. I don't know. And to be able to understand with the other person what really is going on there. And, in the book, it talks about a number of different relationship interventions that have powerful effects. I mean, one of the ones that I really love is this work by Denise Marigold at the University of Waterloo. This is just a lab study, but I think it's so powerful. She brings in couples, and before they have a conversation, she has both members of the couple just think about a time when their partner gave them a compliment and how that reflected something deep and important about the positive regard that their partner had for them. So both people get space to think about their partner in a way that's very secure and strong. And then they go into a conversation about a conflict in their relationship. And the conversations are completely different. They're completely different. There's more humor, they're laughing like you're describing. They're more constructive. People rate them as more positively. That is, the people themselves rate them as more positively. They report feeling more close to each other afterward. Third parties who look at the videos of the two people talking report that the conversations are better and more constructive. The whole thing goes better, right? They're actually able to work on the conflict in the relationship. So once you can address those issues and kind of get them off the table, then you can actually work on the thing that's complicated for you.
There's a lot more we could talk about, but you have interventions, including things like middle school students, people just getting out of a psych hospital, people getting out of juvenile detention centers. There are these big social issues and personal issues and relationship issues, things like relationships between police and their communities, and so many different ways that this plays out. And I wish we had more time to go through a lot more of them, but I think that people can read about them in the books, because I left reading your book feeling incredibly inspired.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah. And in the book, you have a chapter called Toward a Better World, and you talk about these bigger societal problems. And clearly we live in a world right now where there's a lot of problems, and I think we need these tools more than ever. So could you just offer us one thought you're having on something that might help shift things in a positive direction for the world? Is that too big of a question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just talk a little bit about this work that we've done on lifting the bar. So this is work that began in Oakland, California, here with kids coming back to school from juvenile detention. And if ever there was a group that is defined by a stereotype, it's young boys of color who have been incarcerated, right? Which is predominantly what this group of people is. And so lifting the bar is quite simply a platform for young people to think about first for themselves and then to share who they really are and who they want to be. So kids think about the real and true values they have, like to be a positive role model for a younger sister, to make your parents proud, to prepare yourself for college or work, to then think about the ways that relationships with adults in school, that is educators broadly understood, can help them work towards those goals, to give advice to future young people coming back from juvenile detention back into school, and then to share with a teacher who might be that difference maker for them, these qualities, the values that they have, the goals that they have in school, the challenges they face that adult could help with. And so Lifting the Bar was developed in Oakland starting in 2012. We did a very small pilot trial in Oakland and found that with this small pilot trial, it reduced kids who had this opportunity versus kids who didn't, were 40 percentage points less likely to recidivate to juvenile detention through the next full school term, like a transformational consequence for the young people. And now what we've been able to do is develop really deep partnerships with school districts around the country to begin to implement Lifting the Bar and to learn in these implementations how this goes. One of our close partners is Chicago Public Schools, and Chicago Public Schools is beautifully taking ownership of this issue and doing everything it can to implement this in the highest fidelity ways to best serve the young people that they're serving. And I want to just, share one story from an implementation last year. So what happens in Lifting the Bar is the kids go through this program, a letter gets produced, a one-page letter, and that letter that introduces the kid to the adult is hand-delivered to that adult. And the letter says, all kids need strong relationships with adults to succeed. This child has chosen you to be that person for them. Please help them in their relationships with others in school. There will be better days. There will be worse days. Here's what this child would like you to know about them. And the letter is very honorific. It says, thank you very much for your work. You're on the front lines for all of our children. And it comes on joint Stanford and school district letterhead. So imagine you're teaching public school in Chicago. It comes from CPS and it comes from Stanford and it comes to you personally. We find that when this letter is delivered, it's not uncommon at all for teachers to cry. Like it's an incredibly moving, honorific experience to feel that this child has chosen you to be that person for them. But we had an experience not long ago where a teacher didn't cry. The teacher said, I don't know. I've been down the road with this kid. Like, I know this kid, and I don't know if I can do it. And the facilitator who was working, the CPS employee who's working with the teacher said, tell me more. Tell me what's happened. The teacher told a little bit about her past experiences with the child. And then the facilitator said, well, I hear you. It's interesting, though. Still, the child chose you to be this person. He could have chosen anybody. Why do you think he chose you? And the teacher thought about that for a little while. And then the teacher said, you know what I want to do? And the facilitator said, what is it that you want to do? And the teacher said, I think I want to write him a letter. And the teacher sat down and started to write the child a letter. And I just think it's so beautiful. Like, this is a very difficult circumstance. Like, there's a lot of barriers here, a lot of stigma here, a lot of frustration here, a lot of problems. You can imagine the difficulty that a teacher might be in if they're in that circumstance. But the process itself kind of broke open the communication, first between the facilitator and the teacher, and then between the teacher and the student, that hopefully will lead to a better outcome for the young person. And I think there's so many spaces in society today where we need to break open the communications. We need to be able to communicate more clearly and honestly with each other. We need to be able to listen better to each other. We need to be able to recognize other people's pain as well as our own pain. And only when we do that can we actually achieve the kind of society that we really aspire to.
Oh, that's so touching. I'm truly just touched by that, because I think that's so wonderful. And it must be so rewarding to do the work you're doing. And I just really appreciate that it's out there in the world, like having a direct impact on people's lives. I just think that is incredibly valuable. So thank you for doing this work.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing it with us on the podcast today. Again, I'm going to just recommend that people who want to know more about this and want some ideas for other ways they can bring these kinds of principles into their lives, check out your book, Ordinary Magic. It's a fun read. So thank you. And thanks so much. Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.